It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the ASUS VG28UQL1A. Bit of a mouthful, but this is one of the new 144Hz 4K UHD models, that's 3840 by 2160, with HDMI 2.1 connectivity as well. As usual, there is a detailed written review, and you can find a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. Also be aware that, as usual for a video review, what you see depends on my camera, depends on the processing done by my video editing software, processing done by YouTube, and ultimately and very importantly it depends on the screen that you're viewing the video on, so it doesn't accurately represent what the monitor will look like in person. I like to mainly use in-game examples. This is a gaming monitor, it's designed for PC gaming and console gaming, but I appreciate people will be doing other things with their monitors, I certainly do myself. I just like to use in-game examples because they are good to look at in a video, they're interesting, nice and dynamic, plenty to focus on, and it's a good way of exploring key attributes of the image quality and other performance characteristics of the monitor. But these performance characteristics, when it comes to things like contrast, colour reproduction, and to some extent responsiveness as well, this is reflected on the desktop as well. If you're just browsing the internet, if you're watching video content, whatever you might be doing, then these attributes apply there as well. Speaking of attributes, key one here, the 3840 by 2160 4K UHD resolution spread across a 28-inch screen size. That gives you an excellent pixel density, really tight pixel density. So I'm using it without scaling at the moment. I can actually use this monitor without scaling, no problems, but you might want to use a bit of scaling. I think most people will really want to use a bit of scaling. I just managed to get used to it without scaling and I actually quite like the experience there, but don't fear scaling. It's really handled quite well with modern programs. There's an article on the website all about the 4K UHD resolution, has more information about scaling and how that applies, and also just the ins and outs of this resolution for the desktop for movies and games. There's also a bit of a summary in the written review, and there are also some images there just comparing this model running with no scaling, 100% scaling, as I'm using now, or a little bit of scaling, 125% scaling as well. And I found that to be quite a good balance as well, 125% scaling. But considering it without scaling at the moment, you get an excellent amount of desktop real estate, really good for multitasking, and all of this text is perfectly crisp, perfectly readable, really has a good sharp look to it, which you just don't get from a lower pixel density. If you do want to zoom in your application, so using application-specific zoom, or indeed if you are using scaling, then although things become larger and you do lose out in terms of the desktop real estate, so you don't have as much on the screen at the same time, you still benefit from the high pixel density. The clarity is still there for elements that scale cleanly, and many do. So text in this word processing application, Microsoft Word for example, text on this web browser as well, that scales cleanly, so it looks nice and crisp. And suitably high resolution image content, that would include 4K UHD movies as well, and games of course. They really benefit from this high pixel density as well. There's lots of good detail and clarity there. And as I said, this is explored a bit more in the written review in the 4K UHD experience section there. And there's also an article with a similar title which is linked to there. From the front, the monitor has what I like to describe as quite a rugged design. So there are plenty of matte black plastics used for the stand and also the bottom bezel there. A fairly chunky and solid black matte plastic stand neck as well. The ASUS logo there, slightly shiny but not super shiny. Silver for a little bit of contrast against the black there. The top and side bezels are dual stage, so they include a slim panel border that's flush with the rest of the screen, as well as a slender hard plastic outer component. And the panel border, as you can see, when the screen's switched off, that blends in quite well, but as you see elsewhere in the review, when the screen's switched on, that is more visible. The screen surface is what I like to classify as light to very light matte anti-glare. So that means the glare handling isn't quite as strong as some matte screen surfaces, but there are some advantages in terms of the image as well, which I cover in the review, and the glare handling is still pretty good. It certainly doesn't give you sharp reflections like a glossy screen. This is a rather bright room, so you can see some glare. The stand also affords good ergonomic flexibility, so you can adjust the height of the screen, you can tilt it backwards and forwards a little bit, and you can swivel it left and right. And you can also pivot the screen into portrait as shown here. The measurements for these adjustments, as well as measurements which include the depth of the stand, they're included in the written review, but just a note on the depth of the stand, it's not actually too much of a depth desk hog, so if you don't have a particularly large desk, this model is reasonably compact in that dimension. You can see that a bit more clearly from the side. You can see that the screen actually doesn't quite go as far out as what would be the front edge of the stand as well, the front points of the stand. And there's not too much stand back there behind the screen. So it's a reasonably compact design in that respect. At the rear, you can see there are various design elements, lots of interesting patterns, and a few glossy black elements to break up the matte black plastic elsewhere. Then you've got a silver coloured ASUS logo at the top, also some TUF Gaming branding on the stand neck. There's also a little cable tidy solution at the back there. The stand attaches by 100 by 100mm VESA, and you can remove these little rubber covers to reveal screw holes if you want to unscrew the stand and use an alternative VESA 100 compliant solution instead. You can see the OSD controls there. They're explored in the OSD video, which is a separate video accompanying this one. The ports face downwards, so there's a DC power input. This monitor has an external power brick. There are two USB 3.1 downstream ports and a USB upstream port. So the more square-shaped one, that's the USB Type B port, the upstream port. The other ones are Type A ports. You've then got the remaining ports, or the main ports if you prefer. So there are two HDMI 2.0 ports, two HDMI 2.1 ports. So the 2.1 ports, they are labelled HDMI 1 and HDMI 2, and they're the ones that are closest to this DisplayPort 1.4 input, and that's DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC, Dynamic Stream Compression. Don't worry about the word compression, it is visually lossless, don't worry about that, no problem there. 3.5mm headphone jack as well. So in terms of the capabilities, the monitor supports 144Hz or up to 144Hz via HDMI 2.1 and DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC. Or if you're not using DSC, but that will limit the signal range. Again, there's no reason not to use DSC if your GPU supports it. Visually lossless and it gives you better functionality. So you've got the full native resolution, 3840 by 2160. You can have a 10-bit signal, 144Hz. You can do that via DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC. Or HDMI 2.1. HDMI 2.1 will also allow you to use a compatible games console, such as the Xbox Series X or the PS5, at 120Hz at the native UHD resolution. ASUS also is careful to note that this is a 444 full chroma signal, so it isn't a limited range signal like some monitors will enforce on consoles. And you can use HDR at the same time with suitable versions of HDMI and DisplayPort as well. There's also VRR, variable refresh rate technologies. So you've got HDMI 2.1 VRR. HDMI also supports adaptive sync, and that allows you to use AMD FreeSync on compatible GPUs and systems. And you can also use NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode via HDMI. That actually uses HDMI 2.1 VRR rather than adaptive sync. A little bit strange, but has exactly the same effect, works in the same way. And for DisplayPort, you can use AMD FreeSync with compatible GPUs, or you can use NVIDIA G-Sync compatible mode. And the monitor is certified as AMD FreeSync Premium and also G-Sync compatible certified. The screen also includes two 2-watt speakers. I'm not entirely sure, I believe they could be under the grills there. I think they are located there. I haven't really tried to locate the sound myself, but the sound it outputs, it's not particularly high quality, not particularly rich. They're just two 2-watt speakers. They're there for basic sound output, but don't rely on them as your main source of entertainment. You will get better sound output from even a semi-decent pair of standalone speakers, bookshelf speakers, or a half-decent pair of headphones. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm going to talk about the contrast performance of the monitor. This monitor has an IPS-type panel, and this isn't going to give you a deep atmospheric experience. It isn't going to give you amazing depth to dark shades. It isn't going to give you a nice look to dark scenes like this. But even so, there's still some variation in how strong IPS type models perform in this respect. This one, I'd say it's somewhere in the middle really. I recorded just a touch below 1000 to 1. That's after the adjustments made to my test settings. I did have to make moderate adjustments to the colour channels there though. If you leave things there in their neutral position, so out of the box so to speak, it's close to 1100 to 1 in terms of the static contrast. So that is a good way off a decent VA model. in that respect. Still a bit stronger than some IPS type models and slightly weaker than others. The main thing though is the IPS glow. That's at a moderate level. You can see it quite clearly in the video, I'm sure. Towards the corners of the screen, there's this haze that emanates from the corners. It tends to be stronger towards the bottom corners to your eye when you're using the monitor normally, but it depends on your viewing position. If you're sitting with your eyes more centrally, then you're going to see it towards the top as well quite strongly. You will see it towards the top anyway, but it just tends to be stronger towards the bottom from a normal viewing position. And you will see this does certainly affect the atmosphere. It's also something which is brought out more strongly if your unit has an issue with black uniformity, so it has strong backlight bleed or clouding. Mine does have a bit of that towards the top, which is why the IPS glow is brought out a little bit more strongly there. It's not too bad on my unit though in terms of the dark uniformity. And if you're sitting closer to the screen or you're using a higher brightness setting, that's going to bring out the IPS glow more strongly as well. If you're sitting in a better lit room, as I am now, it's not a bright room, but it's not pitch black like it was before, then actually the perceived contrast improves quite a lot. So what I would suggest, and I'd suggest this with any monitor really, any LCD monitor certainly, is if your room is otherwise dark, try and have some light behind the monitor, like a bias light. It can be LED strip lighting, it could be a lamp of your choice really, just to get some light behind the monitor, and that can really enhance the perceived contrast even if the room's quite dark overall. But this is just to demonstrate that in brighter viewing conditions then the IPS glow is not really noticeable in the same way, and the weaker than ideal static contrast, and this applies to any IPS type model, it's not perfect. There's sort of a bit of an edge taken off that as well. I mean, I can still see, certainly to my eye, that the blacks there are not pure blacks. They're not, they're not deep dark. They're not as dark as the bezel, for example, but it isn't as obvious as it is when you're viewing in darker viewing conditions. For brighter shades, so there's the fire there, a good example of some nice bright shades there, and also the white of the little icon above it there, that kind of thing. The screen surface does impart a bit of graininess to these brighter shades, but it's not too bad. It's something I'm sensitive to, so I do notice it. This monitor has what I would refer to as a light to very light matte anti-glare screen surface, but the surface texture isn't super smooth. So what this means is that it doesn't have an obvious layered appearance in front of the image, it doesn't have a smeary graininess either, and the emission of light from the monitor is quite direct, so in terms of preserving the clarity and vibrancy potential, that's good, and that's why you'd often see 4K models like this have that kind of screen surface. Not always, but usually sort of on the lighter side for matte screen surfaces with these. But it's really just that surface texture. It's not super smooth, so there is a bit of graininess. It's not something most people are going to find bothersome. In fact, most people aren't even going to notice it. It's just something that I'm sensitive to. Just so you're aware, I have adjusted the camera so that this is all quite exaggerated. I'm not really trying to show you the uniformity or anything like that, or the IPS glow, except that I would like to cover a feature called dynamic dimming. This monitor has a feature called dynamic dimming. That's a local dimming solution for the backlight. I'm just going to enable that, and I'm just having it disabled at the moment just to give you a bit of a comparison and show you what it does. So this is what it looks like with the feature disabled. It's just a pure black screen being shown at the moment. It's found in the image section of the OSD. And once you enable it, it does say that various functions will be disabled, but it's now activated, and you'll be able to see now things look a lot darker, a lot deeper. If I move the mouse though, you'll see that different sections of the screen light up as I move the mouse around. It doesn't matter if it's at the top of the screen, or it's at the bottom of the screen, or the middle of the screen, it does the same thing. It also reacts very rapidly. You'll see the dimming zones change very rapidly. So what this monitor has, it has 8 dimming zones, and they run as bands down the screen vertically. It has 8 of them across the screen from left to right. I've now got a patch of 50% grey, medium grey on the screen, and you will notice that in addition to the dimming zones doing the kind of thing I was showing you before, they do this even when it's sort of a medium grey with white. Even a tiny little section of white, like my mouse cursor, sets this off. So they are very reactive dimming zones. You also see, or you might be able to see, there's this little kind of inverse halo around the mouse cursor as well. This really threw me when I first saw it because I haven't really seen this kind of behaviour before. It almost looks like there's FALD, full array local dimming. They might show this kind of thing sometimes, but these aren't extra backlight zones. These are actually what I would call pseudo zones. So the monitor is making various gamma adjustments on a very local level. So it's got some kind of digital adjustment going on there. And I couldn't quite work out what the point in this was, but I think it's because the dimming zones are so reactive that they're trying to draw your eye away from the fact that there are these sort of zonal brightness changes for fairly large sections of the screen. So when you're looking at flat uniform shades, or what should be flat uniform shades like this, it can be quite distracting, this whole thing. And I wouldn't recommend using this setting on the desktop in general because of this. A good example where this can be particularly problematic would be Twitter with its dim preset. You can see that those pseudo zones are changing all the time and things look really weird. I mean, there's no other way to say it. It looks like the screen has some awful uniformity issues. And there are other examples where this would happen on the desktop because you've got lots of flat areas of what should be uniform shades. There's not really always very much happening. It's quite a lot of static content. But when you're playing games or you're in movies, then I mean, this can happen from time to time, and I will give you some examples, but generally the content's more dynamic, so you don't really notice this as you would here. I'm now on that same scene on Shadow of the Tomb Raider that I was on before, but I've got the dynamic dimming setting active. Something you have to be aware of with this setting is that you can adjust the brightness, and you can adjust that according to your own taste, just like you would without the setting active. On my unit though, I had to actually reduce the contrast as well to 50. It's set to 80 by default, but this caused lots of crushing at the high end. Lots of brighter shades were crushed together, and it didn't work very well in that respect. I've got the brightness set to 100. You can dim that a bit if you want. It's just according to your own preferences, and it will vary between units. I just thought I'd make you aware that you can adjust these things. So this scene here actually shows the advantages of the dynamic dimming setting quite well, because there are generally really quite dark sections and they're usually in one particular section of the screen, whereas the rest of the screen might be quite bright, or some section of the screen are quite bright. And if I walk through here, the passageway, first of all, you'll notice you can see that IPS glow suddenly diminish. And you'll see as well, because it says Tree of Life Challenge Tomb there, that brightens them up, but when that disappears, the dimming zones at a reasonably rapid pace dim significantly. So the dimming zones covering the brighter area in the middle, they're still nice and bright, and the torch as well, they're nice and bright. But for the darker surroundings, they certainly do dim quite effectively. But if I pull up my bow as well, you'll see that there's brighter content there, so the dimming zones towards the bottom right, so the dimming zones can't just dim, because they've actually got a mixture of brighter and darker content. So yeah, you can see it's not a perfect implementation at all, but it does just take a little bit of edge off the IPS glow, and it deepens up those dark shades a bit. But of course, if you look at this scene more carefully, you will notice that really there's actually a complex mixture of light and dark shades, and the dimming zones just don't have the intricacy to really correct for that. It's really just for those big blocks of darker shade like you've got on the screen at the moment towards the right, which it does add some extra depth to. So it does certainly give you a situational boost in contrast. That's what I like to call it. I'm now on a completely different scene when there's lots going on. So there's lots of vegetation, little wall sections, various objects and stuff. When there's lots going on, as there is here in a scene, I have got the dynamic dimming setting active. You don't generally become too aware of the dimming zones, but there are certainly some instances where you will be aware of them. So where there are the larger areas of more uniform shade, or what should be more uniform shade. So you might notice when I move the mouse around, there appears to be kind of a flickering around the bright object there. And there are some changes as well, just if you look at the sky in general, some sort of shifts. So the dimming zones are doing their thing, and also the pseudo zones, which is causing this kind of strange halo effect. It's creating this flickering. I would have liked to be able to actually disable those pseudo zones and see what things look like with the dimming zones just doing their thing. I suspect that, again, it would have been that the dimming of the main zones would have been more noticeable because large sections of the screen would have been dimming and brightening. But either way, I would have liked to see more flexibility to actually change this. Really, the setting is just on or off, so you can't adjust this according to your own tastes either. And you'll see the flickering and the strange sort of dim versus bright around this tree there as well. That's not part of the game. It's not supposed to look like that. You might also see sort of a effect where the icons there move across the screen. Sort of flickering inverse halo. Quite strange, to be honest. And I'll just disable the setting just for comparison. So the settings are now disabled, and you don't see those strange little inconsistencies now. Because of these inconsistencies and the fact it's a fairly limited number of dimming zones, I'm a bit kind of conflicted on this one, to be honest. In some scenes it does work quite well, in other scenes it's just plain annoying, to be honest. And it really just depends on your own sensitivity to this kind of thing. And you don't have to be sitting in a dark room as I am now to notice these inconsistencies, you certainly don't. But, you know, I would have liked to have seen some flexibility. It's a setting which I think it's nice to have. You know, it is nice to have in some situations, and some people might quite like it. So I like that they've added that flexibility to use it. Sometimes this kind of thing's tied to HDR only, and you can't use it under SDR. So I do appreciate the fact that there is the option to use local dimming for SDR. I'm now on legom.nl, the website, and the test for viewing angles, and I'm just going to talk about the colour consistency of the monitor quickly. So this monitor has an IPS type panel. Colour consistency is a key strength. So with the Legom text, it appears a good blended grey throughout the screen, has a bit of a red tint to the striping of the text, it's a bit stronger towards the left side of the screen, but what you'd see on models with weaker performance in this respect is you'd see obvious shifts between green and saturated red, and also orange as an intermediate shade. With this, it's a lot more consistent than that. That means that the gamma curve of the monitor has a low viewing angle dependency. Next you've got this purple block, which appears a pinkish purple throughout the screen. This always appears very odd on the video, but to my eye it appears fairly consistent pinkish purple throughout the screen, but does have a bit of a stronger pink tint towards the extreme side edges, particularly the left edge there. Can't really see the right edge as clearly because of that scroll bar, but really towards the extreme side edges, a little bit more pink. Red block, good solid red throughout the screen. Slightly darker towards the extreme side edges, but again, not the kind of shifts you see on TN or VA models, and actually some IPS type models are a bit weaker in this respect as well. The green block, a good saturated green chartreuse throughout the screen, no complaints with that one. Blue, as usual, a good solid royal blue throughout the screen. I'm on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to talk about colour reproduction using some in-game examples. It's a little bit more interesting. So the colour consistency, the strong colour consistency, that applies, so that means that shades remain rich and saturated throughout the screen and look pretty much the same if they're displayed centrally versus towards the edges of the screen. That's different to VA models where you would tend to have a weakening of saturation peripherally, particularly towards the side edges and the bottom edge of the screen from a normal viewing position. And with a TN model, you'd have this sort of gradient vertically where things would look too deep, too saturated higher up the screen, and lower down things would become washed out. That's because of these perceived gamma shifts. And I didn't mention this perceived gamma shifts, really, they're what drive the saturation shifts that you see on TN and VA models, and also why IPS type models are particularly strong in this respect and don't really have those kind of distinct shifts. I should have mentioned that when talking about contrast, because it also affects the dark detail as well, not just for these colours, but also the consistency of darker shades. So they appear more consistent. There is of course the IPS glow, so you do get some loss of detail because of that. But on VA models you have this notorious black crush where shades towards the centre of the screen sort of blend into one another, into this black mass. Further out there can actually be a little bit of unintended detail revealed. On TN you get that towards the bottom of the screen, whereas higher up the perceived gamma is far too high and things get crushed, you lose that shade detail. So the gamma consistency of the IPS type panel on this one is very strong, and that does help with the dark scenes as well. Back to these colours, they've got a good vibrant look, fairly vibrant look overall. It's not super vibrant, not super oversaturated, and that's because the colour gamut on this one, it does extend beyond sRGB, but it doesn't extend as much as some wide gamut monitors. I'll just flash the colour gamut up on the screen, just so you know what I'm talking about. So you'll see there was some extension in the pure red region and also some green shades and some green to blue shades, but it doesn't have this sort of universal extension and not extreme extension. So ultimately I measured 87% of the DCI-P3 colour space, and although not shown on the graphic, 83% Adobe RGB, and 99% sRGB. So there wasn't full coverage of sRGB. You might have seen it looked a bit strange in the blue corner of the gamut. There seemed to be a little bit of a shift there. This isn't something which you're going to notice by eye. It's not really something that has any real effect on the image, but it is certainly something which the colorimeter can pick up on. So it's not something I'd worry about. And I think this could be related to the fact this monitor has a shift in the blue peak to less energetic wavelengths, although the ASUS VG28UQL1A had the same, but it could have just been tuned differently. I didn't observe that on the ASUS, but really to the eye, it's not something that you will notice, so it's really not something worth worrying about, it's just something to mention. And also that shift in blue peak, it's actually useful in terms of viewing comfort. It can potentially enhance viewing comfort for those who are sensitive to higher energy blue light. So it is nice to have that shifted to less energetic wavelengths. But what this all means is that there is some oversaturation, so content like this, the game's running in SDR, and if you're just browsing the internet casually as well, most of the content, it's designed with the sRGB colour space in mind, and if the monitor's colour gamut extends beyond sRGB, as this one did in many regions, then you do get oversaturation, more saturation than the content creators or the developers intend. So, as I showed with the gamut, it's not extreme in this case, but there was that push in the pure reds in particular, and this does give these reddish brown tones a stronger red hue than they should have. It's not extreme though, it's not as much of a strong push as some models give, but it does affect the neutrality, and you can see the same with the earthy browns as well. They have a little bit of a reddish push. And it also means that the autumnal reds and oranges, they look rather vibrant, rather eye-catching, a bit less neutral than they should look. But this is really a look that some people quite like. It's really just quite vibrant, without extreme oversaturation. And there's the push with the greens as well. So some of those greens, they look a little bit too eye-catching. They kind of verge a little bit on neon, but it's not extreme in this case again, so it's not too much of a push there. And sometimes I notice yellowish greens tend to have the yellow component brought out far too strongly. In this case, that isn't too bad. Actually, the yellowish greens look, it's a little bit too strong in the yellows, but not brought out in a ridiculous way. And this is very different to a digital saturation boost, so you could, for example, increase digital vibrance on any monitor, or if there's a saturation slider in the OSD, then you could increase that. That's a digital saturation boost. What that does is it pulls shades closer to the edge of the gamut without expanding the gamut itself. What that means is the most saturated shades remain the same, whereas shades which should be less saturated are artificially oversaturated. They're pulled closer to the edge of the gamut, and that crushes things together, so you lose shade variety, and things really just look very cartoonish. Whereas when you achieve this with a wide gamut instead, you maintain the spacing on the gamut, so you get that variety of shades maintained. For those preferring a more muted look, more as the developers intend really, less saturation, there's an sRGB emulation setting on this one as well. You simply set game visual to sRGB mode. And something that's good with this, you can adjust the brightness. You can also adjust the gamma setting. And in fact on my unit 2.5 was close to the 2.2 curve. You can see that in the calibration section of the Vision review more about this, but that does vary between units. It's not necessarily going to be the case. But with this setting, I'll show you the gamut that I recorded. So you'll see that all of that overextension has disappeared beyond sRGB, but there is some underextension. I actually recorded 93% of the sRGB colour space with this setting, and again that is something which can vary between units. This is obviously lower than you'd ideally see. You'd ideally see 100% coverage or close to that, or realistically you could expect perhaps 97% plus, so 93 is rather on the low side. But you'd also have seen from the gamut that it wasn't like a big chunk of the gamut was missing in one particular section. It was actually more of an even spread of the under coverage, and that means that to the eye it isn't as noticeable as it could be. If you're really interested in this kind of thing, then I would recommend looking at the Spider Checker 24 section of the Vision review, because there's some nice visual examples of which kind of shades can become undersaturated and by how much, and which shades appear appropriate. But really, the main thing that you're going to notice with this setting is that the oversaturation is toned down, and some people are definitely going to prefer this look. If you want to use this monitor for colour critical purposes, then really 93% sRGB coverage isn't ideal, and neither is the fact that the color channels are locked. What I would recommend is, if you are using this monitor for color critical purposes and you don't have a colorimeter, then by all means use the sRGB setting, because it's going to be more accurate for you than the native gamut. But ideally you would use a colorimeter or similar device, profile the monitor. You'd be using color aware applications, ICC aware applications, and they would properly map the gamut for you with 100% sRGB coverage without extension beyond. So that's really your ideal state, and they'd make various other corrections as well. So that's what you want for maximum color accuracy. And also things can drift over time, so it's good to recalibrate if you can. Even if the monitor might be set up really well from the factory, things do drift over time. And as I mentioned, 87% DCI-P3, 83% Adobe RGB, so not really useful for accurate reproduction within those color spaces. But really for sort of general consumption on this monitor, I think most people are going to find the standard setting quite nice, the native gamut, the full native gamut, which I'm just going to switch back to just for a little quick visual comparison. And that's because it doesn't give you extreme oversaturation, it just gives you quite a vibrant look, and that's really a kind of look which I think people will find generally quite well balanced and will appreciate. But everyone's eyes are different, everyone's sensitivity is different, everyone's preferences are different, so some people will prefer the sRGB setting. And just to reinforce again that what you see on the video is not an accurate representation of what you'd see by eye. I'm now running Shadow of the Tomb Raider in HDR, high dynamic range. This monitor has VESA DisplayHDR 400 certification. That's the lowest level that VESA will certify for, so don't expect anything miraculous. But I've already covered the fact that this monitor has local dimming, and that works in much the same way under HDR. Actually, it's a bit more reactive under HDR, and part of that is because the monitor can respond to HDR metadata as well. So that means that the monitor is basically being told that certain areas of the image should be nice and dark, they should look nice and deep and atmospheric, and it can very rapidly adjust to that or adjust appropriately to that, rather than under SDR where it's really just looking at the averages of the image. So it's just really not the same level of awareness under SDR. So when you're running under HDR, you don't have control over the same things you do in SDR. So if you take a look at the OSD, you can see that you can adjust things like variable OD, the overdrive setting, adaptive sync as well. You can use VRR, variable refresh rate, under HDR as well. But on the image menu, lots of things are grayed out. But you can disable dynamic dimming if you want. And if you do that, then you'll see straight away things just look flooded. So you can certainly see that the dimming zones do have a good positive effect, especially in scenes like this, where again there's sort of a bright area centrally and much darker shades in general further out. And you'll see that the depth isn't incredible, but that's because it's not just pure black it's displaying here, there's actually an intricate mixture of shades. So you've got 8 dimming zones, it's not working miracles, but it certainly does still give you a bit of an edge and contrast. And with the dynamic dimming setting disabled, basically everything, the whole backlight is just set to essentially its maximum level all the time. There's no dynamic contrast element either, so it's not really great. But here it's pumping out reasonably bright luminance for the brighter areas, and for the darker areas the dimming zones are much dimmer, so that does do its thing, it works, does what it should be doing. But with VESA DisplayHDR 400 there's not particularly high luminance levels, so the daylight area here, the bright elements, they don't look particularly eye-catching. I mean, they're still quite bright, but I measured a bit over 400 candles per meter squared. I can't remember the exact figure, you can see that in the written review, but it wasn't anything spectacular. So it doesn't have this sort of pop to those bright elements that some HDR screens would give you. Now the other setting, there was an HDR setting in the OSD. That has 3 different levels. On my unit, for whatever reason, they do absolutely nothing. If you are connected to an AMD GPU, I'm using an RTX 3090, an NVIDIA RTX 3090 at the moment, but I did test this on my AMD GPU. It was actually locked to console mode, and it did actually look different on my AMD GPU. When it came to contrast, it was very much the same, but the colour reproduction, which I'm going to talk about shortly, that was different. So it basically looked quite oversaturated in much the same way that SDR does. I'm not saying it looked exactly the same as SDR, but there was a definite oversaturation, so things really didn't look as they should under HDR. One of the main points of HDR on the colour side is that it is actually targeting a wider gamut like this monitor uses, and it can use that more appropriately without that oversaturation, so it was a bit odd to see that. So just be aware that if you're using an AMD GPU or a games console, it's going to lock you into console mode, which I think is quite a weird thing to do, to be honest, and you will have some oversaturation. But this is a look that some people are going to like, in fact for the same reasons they'd like it under SDR, so I do kind of understand why they've done that, but I don't really know why they've got 3 settings which do nothing with my NVIDIA GPU and are locked off with my AMD GPU. Also be aware that I've got the monitor connected by DisplayPort, but I tested HDMI and it was exactly the same. It didn't have an effect on things under HDR. So whether you're using a games console, an AMD GPU or an NVIDIA GPU, what I'm talking about here in terms of the contrast performance, and that's really sort of a key area of HDR, is very much the same, but when it comes to the colour areas, that's going to be a bit different. I'm talking again about the intricate mixtures of shades. As you'll see here, you won't be able to see this properly on the video, but there's actually a nice intricate mixture of very dark shades here and some medium shades as well. But HDR10, the HDR10 pipeline, which this monitor responds to, it uses 10-bit colour reproduction, whereas standard SDR content is 8-bit, and this 10-bit colour reproduction enhances your nuanced shade variety, so there's a much better variety of closely matching dark shades here, and that does give you a natural uplift of detail, which is nice to have. Ideally you'd have much more precise local dimming, so you'll see that there are some very dark areas there, like the sort of shaded areas, the cracks in the rocks and the gaps between rocks, that kind of thing. They would be ideally even deeper than they are, and there'd be really very precise control of luminance, and you can get the same thing over there as well. It's not, the dimming zones there are really very bright, but ideally you'd have the rocks higher up looking deeper, and in fact it would show various different levels of brightness, and also the brightness there, it's not just sort of a giant ball of light like it appears in the video, it actually appears a bit more like that. There's actually lots of different levels of brightness which should be displayed. And whilst I'm on that subject, just quickly, this monitor actually does crush some of the whites together under HDR, some of the bright shades, so it doesn't show as much variety as it should there. It's not an extreme amount of crushing, and it may again be something which my unit does, but they don't all do, but I did notice that the distinction of the bright shades wasn't as good as it should be. I've now got the monitor running under HDR. I'm on that scene on Battlefield 5 again, the training range, which show those issues with dynamic dimming. And these issues present themselves under HDR as well, for much the same reason. So again, you can see those pseudo zones doing their thing, and it sort of creates this weird flickering. And the zones in general are shifting, so there are some changes which you're aware of. So I'm just really trying to show you here that where there are larger uniform areas of shades, you can notice the dimming zones and the dimming algorithm doing its thing. Another quite striking example of this, actually I notice this a lot, not just under HDR, but with dynamic dimming in general. Building interiors, they often have large areas of texture with mixtures of light and dark, and the dimming zones can go a little bit crazy, and it can cause some of these issues with flickering and that kind of thing. So again, there are just some scenes that will show these kind of inconsistencies, but where the shade mixture is more complex, you don't notice that. So like I was showing you with Tomb Raider before, and also just the scene here with lots of rocks on the floor, vegetation, that kind of thing, you're not always so aware of the dimming zones. Although you have to be aware that if things change on the ground there, so there are various different shades on the ground, it is reflected in the sky because they're sharing those same dimming zones. So you can notice sort of some changes in brightness in the sky as well from time to time. But again, the sky is what I would consider quite a large area of fairly uniform shade, or just a gradient of shade. So it really is very content dependent. Sometimes this local dimming solution works very nicely, other times it can be quite annoying. This is very different to what I saw on the ASUS VG28UQL1A incidentally. The dimming algorithm was far less aggressive on that, and that did mean that it didn't dim as effectively for very dark shades. So if you had a big section of very dark shade or predominantly dark shade on the screen, then it didn't dim as effectively. Those dimming zones just didn't dim as much. So it wasn't as dynamic in that respect, it wasn't as effective at increasing the contrast. But the plus side was that it was a more gentle approach, which really meant that you weren't generally aware at all of the dimming zones. You just got this slight situational edge and contrast. But with the aggressiveness of the ASUS solution, sometimes it can be annoying, sometimes you can notice those dimming zones. Other scenes it can work very well. So a bit mixed with that, really. So I'm back on that scene on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, still in HDR. And I'm going to do what's customary for me and dive into the water. Well, it's not me diving into the water, it's Laura diving into the water. This scene here, which is one of my favourites still for showing off really good HDR performers, or not so good HDR performers. So the bright elements there, not particularly eye-catching. I mean, they're still bright, don't get me wrong. Certainly bright, especially if you're sitting in a dim room as I am now, but it doesn't have that kind of striking, real eye-catching quality that some HDR models have with high illuminance. And in particular, the fact that the dimming zones are quite broad. You basically have strong brightness for the entire zone, and it doesn't have the same contrasty look that it could have if it had a greater number of dimming zones. So you'll see there, predominantly darker shades, but there's some lighter shades mixed in, so the depth for those darker shades isn't as good as it could be, although it is still enhanced a bit by the local dimming, especially a bit further over there. So the local dimming does help, and it does do its thing. It gives it a nice situational edge and contrast even for scenes like this, but greater precision would of course enhance this quite a lot. And this is again one of those more complex environments, so you're not generally aware of the dimming zones so much, and sensitivity of this could vary, and some people might look at this scene and think it's a bit weird, and yeah, I can see the zones doing this, that and the other. But for me, I personally think that scenes like this are so complex, and when you're sort of absorbed in the game and not trying to focus on the dimming zones, they're not really too distracting. At the higher end, I'm just going to adjust the camera so this is shown more appropriately, because this isn't just a giant ball of light. The 10-bit color reproduction again does its thing, so you have smoother gradients because you've got a greater variety of closely matching light shades as well. But as I mentioned, there is some crushing together of very light shades on this model under HDR, or there was with my unit anyway. So isn't as much distinction as there could be, and ideally you'd have a massive number of dimming zones so that you'd get an excellent variety of bright to very bright to extremely bright shades. That isn't something that you get here. And the 10-bit colour reproduction, plus the fact that the game developers are targeting the DCI-P3 colour gamut. Actually, they're ultimately targeting Rec 2020, a much wider colour gamut, but for the nearer term, DCI-P3 is what they have in mind, and is really where the content will start to look pretty good. So you get a good toning down of colours. Again, remember that this was different with my AMD GPU and will be different on games consoles, but with my NVIDIA GPU, you get a nice toning down of the oversaturation. So Laura's hair, Laura's skin, for example, looks more neutral, looks more as it should, but there are definitely some nice lush greens in the background there that are far beyond what would be shown under the sRGB colour space, and actually some of the blues for that water as well, really quite eye-catching. Nice vibrancy there, but it's not overdone, it's actually intended vibrancy, so things don't look neon or weird when they shouldn't. And also the rocks there, they have a bit of a red push under SDR, which has gone under HDR. And that's actually something which I found quite striking with my AMD GPU, is that they still appeared quite a reddish brown when they shouldn't. And it's not supposed to be team red for that reason. And now in this scene, just to give you a little bit of an exploration of how this looks under HDR, because I did show you this with dynamic dimming earlier. And really the dimming zone behavior is largely the same. I did say it reacts to HDR metadata, which is true, but in this case, that isn't pure black, and because of the fairly limited number of dimming zones, this actually has some medium shades. I showed you the scene with the ASUS VG28UQL1A, which has a much greater number of dimming zones, and that worked really well actually for this scene. You could see these subtle details with skulls and that kind of thing, because there are actually some little medium shades which can be brought out here. On this model, it's kind of lost. There's still some IPS glow, and the contrast isn't incredible here. But I would like to stress again that without local dimming, this really looks completely flooded. So it still captures some of the depth. And if I look carefully, I can see those skulls. But I just want to show you that really the local dimming solution is still quite limited, whether it's SDR or HDR with just 8 zones. Oh, and another thing with the ASUS VG28UQX, which I was mentioning just before, when I zoomed in, there was an excellent bright look to the bow there, and the torch as well. I mean, a really eye-catching look. On this one, there isn't the same thing at all, and also because I had a much greater number of dimming zones, the brighter text there, the white elements would be nice and bright, whereas the darker surroundings, which also cover that zone, would have been much darker. With this one, you need to zoom out so that the dimming zone can be covered with the much darker content, and then the depth does improve, but certainly not to the extent that it did on the ASUS VG28UQX. Obviously that model has a way more complex backlighting solution, mini LED, way more capable when it comes to HDR. Just like to draw the comparison as well, just so you're aware of the limitations with this one. Whee! Dimming disco. Oh. And on another scene on Shadow of the Tomb Raider. So this scene here, again, intricate mixture of shades. So the limited number of dimming zones doesn't exactly produce anything miraculous, but even so, it is still able to dim more for the predominantly dimmer content versus the much brighter content. So the local dimming still does its thing, still has a positive effect in that respect. Good situational edge and contrast. When it comes to the colour reproduction, there is some nice vibrant green shades, but because the colour gamut's only 87% of the DCI-P3 colour space, some of these greens aren't as lush as I've seen, aren't as lush as they could be. The blues of Laura's dress as well, slightly lacking something there. Some of the red shades as well, so things just aren't quite as vibrant, these berries or these fruits there as well. They're certainly still vibrant, but it is something which can be enhanced with an even greater colour gamut than is offered here. I certainly saw that with that ASUS VG28UQX that I mentioned just before. These flowers are quite vibrant, but again not the kind of eye-catching vibrancy that I've seen on some models. But even so, the VESA DisplayHDR 400 level is actually very lax when it comes to the colour gamut requirements, and this one actually is more generous than some when it comes to colour gamut. So some actually will extend just a tiny bit beyond sRGB, and they'll call it HDR, which I think is just insulting, to be honest, because the sRGB colour space is not the target for HDR. It's DCI-P3 or Rec 2020. So having really awful coverage of those doesn't help. This one at least has reasonable coverage of DCI-P3. But again, it doesn't have that sort of neon look to some of these shades, or the red pushes that affects the neutrality. At least with my NVIDIA GPU it doesn't. So it does capture those vibrant elements in a nice way. They look quite vibrant, whereas the more muted elements look as they should. So again, HDR on this one, it's not spectacular, but it is definitely better than some models will provide under HDR. I'm back on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. So this monitor has a 144Hz refresh rate. I've got this game running at 144 frames a second pretty solidly at the moment. So I'm making the most out of the monitor when it comes to responsiveness. This 144Hz refresh rate, it brings you two main advantages. One is that it improves the connected feel when compared to a lower refresh rate, or indeed a lower frame rate. And that describes the precision and the fluidity as you interact with the game world. So remember that the monitor's outputting up to 2.4 times as much information every second as a 60Hz monitor. So that's why it's beneficial in this respect. Having a low input lag really helps with the connected feel as well. Having both together is really the ultimate goal. And this monitor also delivers a nice low input lag. I measured under 3 milliseconds at 144Hz, measured a similar value at 120Hz. At 60Hz, I measured a significantly higher value, 23 or 24 milliseconds, 23 to 24 milliseconds. So it appears that there is a big boost in the signal delay, which isn't a good thing at 60Hz. So I wouldn't say that's an extreme level, but it is noticeable. I noticed it, even when I was just on the desktop when I first ran this at 60Hz. But sensitivity to that varies. Perhaps it could be changed in future firmware. I'm not really sure. But for high refresh rates, the input lag is nice and low. There's very little signal delay. Another advantage of this high refresh rate, high frame rate combination is that it significantly decreases the perceived blur due to eye movement. Perceived blur is a concept which is explored in detail in an article all about responsiveness on our website. Definitely worth checking that out. There's a bit of a summary in the written review in the responsiveness section and also a link to that article. So if you're not familiar with the term perceived blur, definitely check that out. The other aspect of perceived blur comes from the pixel response times. This model is very strong in that respect at these high refresh rates. So I'll just quickly flash up some pursuit photographs. Again, if you want a full explanation, refer to the written review. There are some more examples at various other refresh rates there as well, but this will just help set the scene with this model. So really you can see that there's pretty much nothing to complain about on those transitions shown with the UFO motion test for ghosting there. And it performs very similarly to the ASUS VG28UQL1A, also a very strong performer, which uses the same panel as this one. Other thing to be aware of is that there are different variable OD, variable overdrive levels, and you can see from those pictures that all that really happens when you increase that, you don't actually gain anything except for extra overshoot. So you can see the inverse ghosting, the halo trailing, become brighter, more colourful, more eye-catching. So I'm just going to leave this on OD level 0. There's really no reason to increase that. I would say that some users may find level 1 fine, and it doesn't really provide strong overshoot at these high refresh rates, to be honest, but really the advantage in terms of speeding up the pixel responses is, I'd say it's negligible, whereas the increase in overshoot is more noticeable than that. So with the scene here, it's mainly light to medium shades. There are some darker shades mixed in. There really are no standout weaknesses though. The weakest pixel responses for this scene, perhaps they'd occur with the white text there against the darker background, but even there it's just very minor, what I'd call very faint powdery trailing, and that means it really sticks very close to the object. It's very faint, it's a lot fainter than the object itself. It really has minimal impact on perceived blur. The same with some of these darker shades, like you'll see the dark shade up there, but it's really very minor. There's also some overshoot at these high refresh rates, and when I say these high refresh rates, I'm running at 144 Hz, but with a games console you'd have a max of 120 Hz, and really the experience there is pretty similar. But the overshoots, you can see a little bit of halo trailing, for example, around this palm tree, but nothing that's really going to come across on the video. As you saw with Test UFO, there was nothing that really stood out with the OD level of 0. There's a little bit of what I'd call dark inky trailing towards the left of that. It's another form of overshoot trailing. But as with the other overshoot, it's so faint that it's not what I consider to be eye-catching overshoot. It's not going to be visible on the video, quite sure it won't be, and it isn't something which most users are going to find bothersome at all. I'm on a different scene on Battlefield 5. This one has more dark shades, so more transitions involving darker shades. And even here, there's really nothing to complain about in the way of slower than optimal pixel responses. They're very snappy. There are no real standout weaknesses, just very minor weaknesses here and there. There is some overshoot in places again, nothing particularly eye-catching. Some IPS models will show more distinct weaknesses here. VA models are known to have this smeary trailing for transitions like this. The makeshift roof here against the sky in the background is one that even IPS models will sometimes struggle with. So the ASUS VG28UQL1A I mentioned earlier in terms of its HDR performance, that struggles a lot more with transitions like this. Plenty of transitions on this scene which that will really struggle with. This monitor performs these transitions very well. And actually the PG27UQ, which is one I used as a reference with the pursuit photographs, that's weaker as well. Not as weak as the PG32UQX, but it's weaker than this model. It's a natively slower panel, it needs a lot of overdrive, so it does have more overshoot and also performs some of these transitions more slowly. This monitor also supports adaptive sync. It supports AMD FreeSync on compatible GPUs and systems. It does that via HDMI and DisplayPort. It also has HDMI 2.1 VRR support, and you can use NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode using that protocol, so to speak. And you can also use adaptive sync with DisplayPort as an NVIDIA user using G-Sync compatible mode. And that's what I'm using at the moment. I've got an RTX 3090 in my system. I've also tested AMD FreeSync with my AMD GPU. The experience was very similar with both AMD FreeSync and NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode, whether using DisplayPort or HDMI as well. So what this VRR, variable refresh rate technology, does is it gets rid of tearing and stuttering from frame and refresh rate mismatches. If you can see that very small number in the top right, because the pixel density is very high with this one, that's why it's such a small number and no scaling is being used. So it's actually reading around 137, 138, so it's below 144. If I wasn't using adaptive sync, I would get tearing if I had VSync disabled, or I would get stuttering with VSync enabled, just because of these frame rate and refresh rate mismatches. But with adaptive sync or VRR support, the monitor is constantly adjusting its refresh rate to try and match the frame rate to get rid of that tearing and stuttering. And someone like me who's very sensitive to tearing and stuttering, it's a very welcome thing to have. Not everyone is so sensitive to it, so it's not always a night and day difference, depends on your sensitivity to this kind of thing, but it certainly can be nice to have if you're sensitive to that kind of thing. I've ramped up my graphics settings a bit, still a little bit above 100 frames a second, but certainly quite a way away from 144 now, and I can notice an increase in overshoot. Now this is worth noting, this monitor does have variable overdrive, it even calls its overdrive setting variable OD, but I have noticed an increase in overshoot as the refresh rate decreases. This is linked to the refresh rate, by the way, not the frame rate, so if you have it running at a static 120 Hz or 144 Hz and your frame rate drops, you're not going to get extra overshoot, and actually you're going to have that relatively low level of overshoot which I was talking about before. But now I can see it more clearly. I don't know if it'll come across on the video, but to the left of that flag post, it isn't too bad at this level though. It's around or above 100 Hz, so it's not too bad. I've increased the graphics settings further just so I can get my frame rate down, and the overshoot is now a lot stronger. So the point in variable overdrive, or the main point in variable overdrive, is that it's supposed to retune the overdrive to avoid this kind of thing. So it's supposed to slacken off the pixel responses for lower refresh rates, because you don't need as high a level of acceleration. The pixel response requirements for optimal performance are a lot lower. And if you use the same level of acceleration or a strong level of acceleration at these lower refresh rates, then you do get this extra overshoot. If you recall, I'm using OD level 0, which is the lowest overdrive setting you can use. And as you can tell from this, it isn't off. It's not right to call it off. It's actually still a rather aggressive level of acceleration. It works very well at high refresh rates, but at lower refresh rates like this, you do start to see this overshoot. I wouldn't say it's extreme overshoot, but I wasn't actually initially expecting to see much, if any, of this, given that it does advertise variable overdrive. However, it's something which I observed on the ASUS VG28UQL1A using this panel as well. If you had the setting set to off at 60 Hz, you'd get this as well. And although I haven't reviewed it myself, the Gigabyte M28U, also based on this panel, that has the same issue. So I think it's likely that this panel has its own native overdrive circuit, and you can't disable that, you can only add to it. So I don't think this is ASUS's fault that there is this overshoot. I think it's just from the native acceleration of the panel. But overshoot aside, there's really nothing to complain about in terms of weaknesses. The pixel responses across the entire variable refresh rate range, they are certainly very fast enough for an optimal or close to optimal performance, so you don't have to worry about sort of smeary trailing or anything like that, anything even close to that. The technology, variable refresh rate technology, it works down to an advertised 48 Hz on this monitor, so if your game drops below 48 frames a second, then the technology is still active, but it uses something called LFC, low frame rate compensation, or that's actually how AMD refers to it, but it uses exactly the same kind of technology with an NVIDIA GPU as well. And what this does is it sticks to a multiple of the frame rate with its refresh rate, and that also keeps tearing and stuttering at bay. The only thing to be aware of is that when this point is crossed, and I should mention it's not always exactly 48 Hz, sometimes it seems to be a little bit higher, maybe up to 52 Hz, perhaps 53 Hz. It just depends on the situation and what the frame rates come down from. It's not always exactly 48 Hz where this will activate, but there is this momentary stuttering when the boundary is crossed and LFC kicks in or it deactivates going the other way. And if you're frequently crossing that boundary, that could be bothersome. But for most people, it's just a very slight stuttering. It's actually going to be less noticeable than any stuttering you'd get from frame and refresh rate mismatches. But it is there, and ideally it wouldn't be there, so if you're frequently passing that boundary, do be aware of this. The monitor also has a strobe backlight setting called ELMB, Extreme Low Motion Blur, or ELMB Sync, which is the same but actually allows you to use VRR technology at the same time, so that's quite novel actually. I'm not going to go through this in detail because all you see in the video, I'm afraid, is annoying flickering on the screen. I can't really show you the benefits of this technology, but it is explored in some detail in the written review, in the contrast section, and certainly in the responsiveness section. And it does achieve its main goal of reducing perceived blur due to eye movement, so the main object clarity is improved. Even with rapid movements on the game, there is a definite improvement to the clarity compared to with the technology deactivated, but you have to be aware of the fact that the backlight is flickering, so it's not flicker-free anymore. That's exactly how strobe backlight settings work, but it's nice to be able to use this in a VRR environment because it's not always easy to have your frame rate matching your refresh rate exactly. And usually with these technologies you can't have VRR active at the same time, so you could be in a situation where you have a clear mismatch between the two, or even a slight mismatch between the two, and that would cause very clear stuttering. Anyway, this is explored in detail in the written review, so I'm not going to say too much more about that. It does work. It's not a perfect implementation. It has issues with strobe crosstalk. It has issues with the KSF phosphors creating colourful fringes. It has colourful flashes as well, all sorts of things, all explored in the written review. But it is there, and it does work with VRR technology if you want to use it. To wrap up then, the monitor does have a fairly rugged looking design, that's how I describe it. I wouldn't call it beautiful or elegant or particularly minimalistic, but it isn't as in-your-face gamery as some designs. It just has lots of quite chunky looking plastic. It also offers good ergonomic flexibility with a stand, fully adjustable, so that's good to see. The height adjustment isn't as generous as some models. I also found it a little bit catchy, the height adjustment mechanism. It wasn't as smooth as I've seen on some models, but this generally isn't something which you will use too much, and it does still work. In terms of the image quality, contrast of course isn't the main strength. Fairly typical IPS performance there. Moderate amount of IPS glow, quite similar to specified static contrast, slightly higher depending on the settings you use. So it's a little bit stronger than some IPS models, a bit weaker than others. The very light matte screen surface I found agreeable as well, except it was a touch on the grainy side, but that's really just something I'm particularly sensitive to. I still did like the light to very light matte quality, so it didn't have a clear layered appearance or anything like that in front of the image. The strong pixel density and the screen size, I like that as well. I could use it no problems with no scaling. I know some people would have to use scaling or would want to use scaling, totally understand that, but even so, the pixel density itself being very tight, definite benefits to be had there. The colour reproduction, it offered some extension beyond sRGB with the gamut, fair bit of extension beyond sRGB, but not reaching as far as some wide gamut monitors, so 87% DCI-P3. The coloured gamut isn't really enough for colour critical work within the DCI-P3 or Adobe RGB colour spaces. Certainly sufficient for colour critical work within the sRGB colour space, but for general consumption it provides a bit of extra vibrancy for most content which is designed with the sRGB colour space in mind, but not extreme oversaturation or anything like that. A bit of extra saturation. I think it strikes a balance which most people will actually find quite agreeable. And the colour consistency is very strong as well, so it doesn't have clear shifts in saturation at different points of the screen. It also offers an sRGB emulation setting. I wouldn't say that's the best sRGB emulation setting I've come across, at least it wasn't on my unit, because it did have a fair bit of undercoverage, and it's not fully flexible, so you can't adjust the colour channels, but it did let you adjust the brightness, which was good to see, and it certainly toned down the saturation, so it will be certainly a usable setting for some people. Some people will like to use this. In terms of its HDR performance, I'd say it's fairly middling in that respect. It's actually, although it's only VESA DisplayHDR 400 certified, it does offer a more dynamic experience than some in that category because it has 8-zone local dimming, but it did have a rather aggressive dimming algorithm, which meant that sometimes you did notice these fluctuations in the backlight and the algorithm in general. You could also use this dynamic dimming feature under SDR if you like as well, so that was quite a nice thing to have, nice flexibility to have I suppose. I would have liked to be able to adjust the aggressiveness of the dimming algorithm because I do think it was a bit too noticeable in some scenes and it could potentially be quite annoying at times. But outside of that, the colour gamut was put to good use under HDR, at least on my NVIDIA system. With my AMD system, it locks itself into this console mode, which doesn't really present HDR in such an accurate way, but it presents colours a bit more like what you'd see under SDR, and that would be the same on games consoles. It would lock itself into console mode. The different modes were accessible with my NVIDIA GPU, but they didn't actually do anything. I'm not sure if that's intended behaviour or if it's because I'm using an early pre-release sample of the monitor. But either way, I did find, at least with the constraints of the colour gamut, HDR implementation with my NVIDIA GPU quite good. In terms of responsiveness, the monitor performed very well at high refresh rates. The VRR support's very good as well. Adaptive Sync worked exactly as I'd hoped on my NVIDIA and AMD GPUs. It supports HDMI 2.1 VRR as well, so that's a good flexibility to have. Something which you'd be able to use on the PS5, for example, which doesn't support Adaptive Sync. As far as I'm aware, it hasn't actually been activated on the PS5 yet. I might be wrong about this, but I don't think the feature is actually available yet, but that's a Sony issue rather than a monitor issue. This monitor is ready with the feature, HDMI 2.1 VRR, and either way you can use 120Hz at the same time as the 3840 by 2160 resolution, or up to 144Hz if you're a PC user. I was less impressed with the performance at lower refresh rates, so at 60Hz for example, overshoot was rather strong. This includes in a VRR environment if you got there with your variable refresh rate because your frame rates are that low. It wasn't just 60Hz actually, it was just really anything in the double digits, the overshoot became pretty strong, but 60Hz was certainly quite strong by then. And another thing that's just worth slipping in here, ELMB sync, it did work. I wouldn't say it was perfect, certainly many strobe backlight settings with monitors with this kind of backlight I wouldn't say are perfect, various issues there, but it did work, and it did work in the variable refresh rate environment. It worked quite well in the triple digit frame rates in particular, but this is explored in detail in the written review. So that's really all there is to the ASUS VG28UQL1A. Be sure to check out the full review on PCmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do.